I know the story's too complicated for you. I can see your eyes getting glossy already. But what happened is the owner of the 4 acres told me, you can't use the land. Just making us homeless, just like that. The whole bunch of us, all the students and me, nowhere now that we can use. And I appealed to her, but no, there was no getting through it, because she was afraid if we use her land, then the government might confiscate her land, and it would just be lost. So she said, no, you can't. And, well, that story isn't over yet. Monica is still an Adventist. She still lives in Malaysia, and she's still under threat of violence and still under pressure to get married. And it'd be nice if we could find a man that would like to marry her, but, you know, Western Adventists are mostly westernized people, and in Western cultures, you marry for love. We don't do arranged marriages here, so even if I do find an ideal man for her, it doesn't mean he wants to go there and find her. Yet, so would you just pray for Monica that somehow God will find for her a companion? Wouldn't that just be a nice miracle for her? Because without that miracle, the future of her life doesn't look pleasant. I'd like you to turn in your Bibles to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2. There are some positions that Adventists have, or I should say Adventists at one time had, that seem to be reducing in their, that isn't even English. Let me try that sentence over. There are some things that your Adventist parents believe that you might not believe as strongly as they did. And since most of you look like Adventist parents and grandparents, maybe your children don't believe as strongly as you do. Maybe kind of like that. One of those is the Adventist teaching that we should not use alcohol. I think that wasn't that a strong teaching of the church here in Australia some 100 years ago, that we don't use alcohol? And yet I think that there's been teaching to the contrary, even in this very camp in the last few years, that it's okay, that people, that there's nothing wrong with it. I just want to give you a little tool with that. In the Old Testament, there are 2 classes of people who are not permitted to use alcohol. One of those are the priest. I think you know that from the story of Nadab and Abihu, that they went a little bit drunk into the sanctuary and they offered up common fire and God destroyed them. And from that experience, when God commented on that and told Aaron, you can't even go through a period of mourning for these boys, because that would look like that you don't hold this judgment to be fair and right. That's what God required of Aaron, not to mourn for them. That seems so hard, but that's what God required, because righteousness in a nation is important. God said it's not for priests to drink. Then later you find in Proverbs chapter 30 those words to Lemuel. Lemuel, probably his mother, is writing to him and says it's not for kings, not for princes to drink strong drink, lest they forget the law and pervert justice and judgment. So what 2 classes were not to drink in that Old Testament? Not the priest and not the judicial princely class, not the ones who are teaching and educating the law. Those ones were not to be drinking. And now you come, I think I told you 2 Peter, but I should have said 1 Peter. That's only 3 pages back, so you can adjust pretty quick, can't you? 1 Peter chapter 2, and looking at verse 9. 1 Peter 2 verse 9 says, but you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. A what? Royal priesthood. That is, you are both of those classes. You are the 2 classes in the Old Testament that were not permitted to drink. You are the priesthood, and you are the Levites, and you are the royalty. That's what it says here. You're the royal priesthood, a chosen generation. So here you are in those categories, So God says to Seventh-day Adventists, no, drinking isn't for you. You're the ones who are to be teaching the law to people. You're explaining the law to people. You're telling them what God requires, and you ought not to have a fuzzy mind. Maybe it's okay for someone that doesn't know how to find a way to resolve their grievances and their griefs, but it's not for you to drink. When Muslims are arguing against the Bible, I think you should know that they probably aren't the Muslims that you are going to win for Jesus. Do you remember what Jesus said there in Matthew 7? He said, do not cast your pearls in front of swine. He said, don't give your holy things to dogs. And then he gave you some justification for that. He said, lest they trample them underfoot, and then when they're done trampling your pearls, they turn again and they injure you. This is what Jesus said. What does he mean? What he means for me is that when I meet a new man in Bangladesh, I don't just start telling him about the gospel. I don't ask him to give his life to Jesus. I do some diagnostic work first. I need to know to what extent he has imbibed radical nonsense. And so I will talk to him first about health. I'll talk about how to reverse his diabetes and how to reverse his high blood pressure and how to deal with his kidney issues and not to restore kidney function. You really can't, once you lose that, it's lost. But how to prevent a greater loss of kidney function. I'll talk to him about those things, but then I'll start talking about religious liberty. I often ask a question like this. I'll say, I want you to imagine that you have a cousin who leaves Islam and becomes a Christian because he really believes it's true. Do you think that cousin, I know you'd be sad that he did that. I know it would hurt your heart. I know that you'd really be you wouldn't be pleased at all about that. But my question is, do you think you ought to leave the punishment of that cousin to Allah? Or do you think that humans ought to punish him? Do you think the state ought to hurt him? Do you think his family ought to hurt him? Should he be punished for his views, or should you leave that to God? Do you understand the question I'm asking? And if he says he is interfering with the peace of society, he needs to be punished. What I just discovered is I'm talking to a dog and a swine. Do you understand what I'm saying in metaphor? That this is not the person with whom I'm going to be sharing Daniel 2 and 7. This isn't the one. I'm looking for the one who says, God will take care of him. People ought to be allowed to think for themselves. People ought to be allowed, I'll pray with him, I'll study with him, I'll invite him back from Islam. But no, of course, we shouldn't hurt him. I'm looking for that man. And if he gets through that question well, then I know I'm talking to someone who doesn't have a radical bone that's going to come back and poke me. Poke is not the right word for what radical bones do. So anyway, I'm doing something like that diagnostic. I'm encouraging you also to do diagnostic work. But when Paul is talking to the Galatians, and they have been deceived by those Judaizing persons that are saying you must be circumcised, when he's talking to the Galatians, he makes quite a distinction between those who are doing the deceiving and those who have been deceived. This is in chapter 5. In chapter 3, he speaks to the ones who've been deceived. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" He appeals to them to come back to the truth. But in chapter 5, he says about the ones who are doing the deceiving, he says, "I wish they were even cut off, which trouble you." That is, I wish they were removed from the church. The ones who are taking the lead and teaching these false doctrines, I wish they were disfellowshipped, he said. In the same way that Paul makes a distinction between the false teachers and the ones who are deceived, I have to make a distinction between the radicals and the ones deceived by the radicals. So even with those kind-hearted, open-minded people that I just mentioned to you, the ones I'm going to share with, they might come to you and they might say something like, the Bible is full of violence. You know, they're kind of sensitive to that topic because Christians often accuse them of having a violent religion. Christians accuse the Quran of being a violent book. Most of them don't really believe the Quran is a violent book. But when they don't believe it, you have to understand something about that is hard for you to relate to. They believe it's a book of peace, but they can't read it. They really don't know what it says. They believe it's a book of peace, but they don't read it. They don't read translations of it into their own language. They don't know what it says. And so why do they believe what they believe? It's because in Islam, there's nothing called the priesthood of believers. There's nothing in Islam that says that every one of you can search your own way for God. And one of the objections you're going to find when you start reaching out to your Muslim friends and neighbors is many of them will say to you, I'm not qualified to talk about religion. They'll say, I don't know. That's not my specialty. I'm sorry, I can't talk about that. I don't know anything about it. That's not me. When you hear that and you're going, what? We're talking about your faith, not your imam's faith. But do you understand how that priesthood of believers idea has really, it changes your view of so many things so that you feel like everyone can talk about religion, that any two people can talk about truth and try to come to harmony and prayer and prayerfully study together. And you need to work through this with them. But can I talk to you a bit about that violence thing? What you're going to find here? In the Old Testament, God did have a plan to dispossess the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites. He did have a plan to take those people out of the way and put into that beautiful land the children of Israel. And God's plan was to chase them out with wasps. It's twice in the Torah, this plan. It's described there. God said he would do it, that he would chase them out with wasps. And when God chases, if God chases me off this campus with wasps, I'm running. Aren't you? The wasps don't have to kill me. They don't even have to sting me. All they really have to do is be coming from that direction towards me, and the direction I'm going is that way. Because I just don't like wasps chasing me. What I'm trying to say to you is God doesn't have to kill the Canaanites to move them. All he has to do is move them with those wasps. But there were some experiences that Israel went through where they didn't follow God's counsel at the very beginning. And you remember how they went and tried to fight when God told them not to go? Right after they accepted the 10 spies, bad stories, they tried to fight. And so they ended up then having to fight. And they did. And when they did fight, God did tell them to destroy, in some cases, men, women, children, infants, kill them all. And a whole tribe. We have a nice English word for that now. It's not a nice word, but what do we call that word? We call that genocide. Genocide is pictured in the Bible very directly, where God specifically says, destroy the Amalekites at a certain time. Not yet, not yet, not yet, now. Destroy the Amalekites, all of them. Man, woman, children, nursing children, the whole bit, kill them all. I just want to explain that to you so you can see it. And I'll do it with an illustration. I was on a vacation. My wife and I do that every 5 years, take a vacation. And on that vacation, I misjudged my ability to ride a scooter. You know, when I had been a young boy, I'd had my own three-wheeler, and I'd used that for a long time. And then 25 years later, in my mind, I was just thinking, if I could ride a three-wheeler at 11, I can do a scooter at 36. You understand that kind of logic? But it's not good logic. I'll tell you, it's not good logic. I should have had someone help me for an hour or two, or at least for a few minutes. But I just rented one and got on it with never having used anything like that ever in my whole life. And when I revved it the first time, it took off faster than I expected. And that threw me back. And that made it go faster. And I was instantly out of control. Because, this is in the first 2.5 seconds of riding the thing. And since I wasn't out in a great big parking lot somewhere, I was actually in a populated center by a road, facing the road. God did arrange that there was no cars to hit me when I went into the road. Isn't that very nice of God? Very, very kind of him. And I zipped right across the road and ran right into whatever's on the other side. And the point of contact was this thumb. Kaboom! And it didn't have time to be going very fast, but it did shatter the bones in this thumb into like several little fragments. And it did do some damage to the bike. I, being a very stubborn and not sufficiently common-sensed boy, thought I had just jammed my thumb. You've jammed your thumb. You know how it swells up. And I thought I jammed my thumb. So I didn't go for an x-ray or anything. I just waited for the swelling to go down. And it didn't go down for weeks. And finally, I went and got an x-ray and realized I had made a big mistake. Because when you let your bone fragments go for weeks without doing anything, they start fusing in whatever shape they happen to be in. And what I was really looking at was an entire life of a thumb that would stick out like that, unbendable and swollen. I was really looking at that. And that's when someone volunteered to pay for me to get a surgery on the thumb. Now, you should know that I am allergic to needles. I don't know what you're afraid of. I'm sure there's something. For me, it's not heights. It's not people. It's needles. Probably because when I was a little baby, I was bitten by a rabid bat, and I got those 13 shots in my stomach, and I was too young to explain it to me, so I couldn't understand why my mom was taking me in for torture every day. You have to do it every day for those babies that have that, and so I think that's probably where it came from. But somehow, I got this fear of needles that's deep enough where intellectually I know it doesn't hurt that much. It doesn't hurt that long. I'm sure I can handle it, but it just doesn't take away the very creepy feeling that I get when the needle's coming close to me. Does anyone have a phobia you can relate to what I'm trying to explain to you? Maybe you probably can't. Well, just be glad. So I have a phobia of needles, and I knew if I get that surgery, they're going to have to give me an IV. And the surgery is elective. I don't have to get the surgery. I can just go with my thumb. It doesn't hurt anymore anyway. I can just have my little banner for the rest of my life. So I chose to have the surgery. And you could ask me, why would you, someone who really hates needles so much, why would you voluntarily let a needle be put in your wrist? And I would have to answer you because I'm comparing a few seconds of great discomfort with many years of utility. I'm comparing something this long with something this long. And so I'm willing to choose some serious discomfort because I'm thinking of the big picture. Do you think I made was that a good decision I made? So when I'm sitting there ready for it, and they put in the one IV, it's only a few minutes later, and another nurse comes and wants to put an IV in the other arm. But anyway, I just accepted it, but it didn't seem fair. But anyway, so I have, and they did the surgery, and she put 2 pins in there, and I remember the day that she pulled the pins out, she said, "This isn't going to hurt." And I was thinking, how do you know? Because she had something that looks like pliers. And she's going to grab the pin, and she said she's going to pull it. And she says it's not going to hurt. And I just can't figure that. But anyway, it worked out. It didn't really hurt very much. And so what I'm trying to explain to you is that it's worthwhile to have a little bit of suffering to have a great deal of good times. And aren't you glad I can do that now? That means that the surgeon did a good job. It worked out for me. This is why God has allowed suffering in the world. This is why God is allowing people to suffer. Why it's allowed that people, you are suffering, I suppose. And you know people who are suffering more than you are. He has let it all happen. Not that it's comfortable, it's extremely discomfortable to you and to God. It's just terribly discomforting. That doesn't sound like English, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's terribly unpleasant. Terribly. And so here is God, and he just deals with it, because what's coming after 6,000 years of misery, what's coming is trillions of years of pleasantness. And is that a good decision? Is it sensible? It's sensible if what it takes to get to that pleasantness is great discomfort and suffering, it's even worthwhile. Even if it's 1,000 people suffering for 60 years, for one person to live forever, that is 60,000 years of suffering compared to 60 quadrillion years of happiness. It's still a very good decision. People of Port Concords of Port Macquarie, don't do it. That wasn't God speaking to you. He's not doing that today. There's a reason why he did it when the population of the earth was small. And you can feel it partly in yourself. You today don't have a very easy time resisting temptation. Isn't it true that you struggle a bit? Isn't it true that just trying to control your temper and your sensual urges and your honesty and your greed and your appetite is just difficult sufficiently already? You wouldn't even be pleased if it was just several notches more difficult. But how difficult it is for us today is a direct product of the inheritance we have, the moral inheritance. It's because we've inherited a moral degradation that it's so hard for us today. So what did God do? It's a little bit similar to what he set up in nature called survival of the fittest. That is, if you go out there into the jungle, let's see, what do you have animals here? I guess you don't really like your kangaroos. Do you like your bandicoots? Do you like them all right? Or do you just like them also? I'll just talk about my own animals. Okay, so if you talk about the beautiful raccoons of North America, if a raccoon is born there blind, it's not very likely that he's ever going to pass on that defective gene. He's going to be eaten by some black bear somewhere. It's not very likely that he's going to pass that on. And something like that could work in humanity if we chose our spouses more carefully. Something like that could work in humanity. That is, before the flood, the children of Seth were choosing the godly people for their spouses, and the children of Cain were choosing the ungodly for their spouses, and that was maintaining the godly people pretty well until something happened. Have you read it there in Genesis 6? Until it happened that they stopped using that selection process. And when they did, the moral degeneration of their race came very quickly after that. Very quickly. And so when the population of the earth was small, God took the Amalekites. What do we know about the Amalekites? We don't know a lot about them, but we know that they used terrorism. They would torture captives, torture them, and advertise the torturing of them in such a way that everyone would be afraid to fight them, that they would just become tributary without a fight because they didn't want to be tortured. They used that. Now, if you're torturing someone like that just to have power and money, what does that do to your character? It doesn't leave it in good condition. It really creates degradation quickly. And the Amalekites were having that kind of degradation. You can see the degradation of the Canaanites in the story of Deborah and Sisera. When you see Sisera's, is it his wife or his mother that's talking, waiting for him to come home? I forget whether it was his wife or his mother. I think it might have been his mother. So there she is, and she's talking about, oh, each one of the soldiers probably grabbed a few damsels for themselves. Does that sound like she has a good morality or a bit degraded? A bit degraded right there, you see. And so here's severe degradation, and God says, let's get rid of all of these genes. Let's not let these end up being mixed up with humankind. And by doing that, it was the same thing that happened at the flood. He's made it much easier for you today. If you had in you today some Amalekite genes and some of those other genes, those few groups of people that were totally wiped out, it would be harder for you and harder for me. And would you just agree it's harder? It's hard enough. It's hard enough today. Well, someone says, but what about the baby Amalekites? Couldn't they grow up and be believers? Have you read this about Rehoboam? No, it's Jeroboam. About Jeroboam, how God said that his son, his baby, would die and would be the only one that would be buried. And have you read why he would be the only one buried? What it says is because in him only, of all the family of Jeroboam, God sees some good thing towards the Lord. I just love that verse because Jeroboam doesn't have good parents. He doesn't have a good family. And what does God see in that Jeroboam's baby doesn't have a good family. And what does God see in that baby? He sees something good. He sees something worthwhile. And consequently, that baby isn't going to share in the curse that's on the rest. He's going to die and be buried. And you might say, oh, poor thing. But no. Trust God. To die and be buried isn't so bad as to be raised in a wicked home. It's not so likely to cause your undoing as to be raised in a wicked home. It's the best thing that could have happened to that baby. And what I want to say is for dear little Amalekite angel who is killed as an infant, if you could see him grow up and tell you what he thinks, he's very glad that he could die and be saved eternally rather than passing on his weakness to you and making your life harder. The best contribution that he could make in this universe is not to pass on his moral degradation. He has done what he can do. And growing up would not increase his likelihood of being saved. Do any of you understand what I mean when I say that growing up would not increase his likelihood of being saved? There are even babies and infants in Sydney for whom growing up will not increase the likelihood of them going to heaven. Growing up will decrease the likelihood of them going to heaven. And it might not be that every time a baby dies that heaven views that as a tragedy. It might be. I know someone's going to quote that and going to get me in trouble, but I'm trying to help you understand something, that there's a reason why you see genocide soon after the flood and you never see it again in the rest of the Bible. There's a reason. It's because God was eliminating when the population segment was small. When the population segment is small, if you have a defective gene, that gene ends up being mixed with the whole. That even today, when you talk about the study of biology, natural biology, that if a population segment is it called the swift parrot, the one you have down there in Melbourne that's nearing extinction, the swift. So if the swift parrot ends up getting too small, the population size, it means that the genetic defects in that small group are going to end up spreading all through it, so they're all going to have them, and there's not even much of a chance that they'll not go extinct at that point. There's a minimum number you can have before genetics eat into each other. The inbreeding destroys the population. That's what I'm trying to say to you. So God, at the time when the population was small, removed a lot of those defects and made it possible for us to be alive today. Morally alive. Turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 5. Now when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. I just realized something. I'm going to talk about this afternoon because I need to have a Q&A session because two of you told me you want to ask questions, and I only have 8 minutes left. So today, this afternoon, come back for Matthew 8, but does someone have a question you'd like me to answer in my last few minutes here? I know at least one of you should because you told me you were going to. Does someone have, but if you don't, I'll go back to Matthew 8. Yes, go ahead. So you said easiest. You use the EST on that word. How about I give you some ratios? I think that if I talk to 100 people from Afghanistan or Iran, I might find 20 to 30 that have an interest in the gospel. If I talk to 100 from Somalia, I might find 0 or 1. So there's a real contrast there. I think if I talk to 100 from Malaysia, the Malay people, it might be 2 or 3. If I talk to 100 from Indonesia, it might be 20 or 15 to 20. I think if I'm talking to those who are living in Sydney from Somalia, it's going to be a much higher number than those living in Somalia from Somalia. And if I talk to those living in Sydney from Yemen, it's going to be a much higher than those living in Yemen from Yemen. So that it really is true among different population segments that the ratio is different, but there's a miracle you need to keep in mind, and that is God will help you find the minority. He'll help you find, because I told you, I think I told you that in January we baptized a doctor from Somalia. And God, he was a rare man, and there aren't many people doing what I'm doing, and somehow God helped us find each other. That's just a miracle. So when you begin doing his work, God will work that miracle for you. Even if the number is few, push through it, you'll find them. Did I see a hand over here? Yes, go ahead. So maybe also I should do that tomorrow. I'll tell you now where it is, and then tomorrow I'll explain it in this lecture. That's Revelation 9. And what you see there in Revelation 9 is God in chapters 8 and 9 is describing 7 judgments on Rome. Now these are judgments. In Daniel you have that Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Well, when you come to the time of Revelation, Babylon, Persia, and Greece are already past. So you're in the time of Rome, and Rome, according to Daniel, is going to persist all the way to the end. That's why you don't find in Revelation another succession of beasts, because Rome persists. But instead, God shows you the judgments on Rome that lead to its dissolution. And 4 of those judgments, the first 4 in chapter 8, are judgments on Western Rome that involved Rome transitioning into Europe. But the judgments on Eastern Rome involved Rome transitioning into Islam, into the Ottoman Empire. So that's chapter 9. And it really is fascinating, those prophecies. So tomorrow, same place, same time, yeah. What is your name? So Nick is saying that, and he's right, that the Muslims typically believe that Jesus was a good prophet that was here on earth and did good work, but because of Zakir Naik, one of their evangelists, their public evangelist, they often will say to you, where does Jesus claim to be God? That's a typical response. I will say to you that when they say that to you, you're talking to someone who's been trained to argue, and they probably aren't in learning mode. And they might not be the same person that you're going to have a good chance to help. They might not be. But suppose it is a searching person, there's a few things that you can say. One is that Jesus really doesn't talk about himself that way. You don't find him saying, I am God. You don't find him saying that I have brown hair. You don't find him saying that I weigh 45 kilos. You just don't find him talking like that. But he does say some things that only make sense if you are God. And John chapter 1, verse 1, that's just a very good verse for them. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. This idea, they can see, it's very clear in verse 14 and 12 that that Word is Jesus. But you can show them where Jesus said, I am. And that idea, but again, am I going to show this to the person who's out to teach me? Not really. What I'm really going to say to him is something different. I'm going to say, friend, God is high above us. There are so many things that are beyond our comprehension. I don't claim to understand everything about him. Only the things that the prophets say do I claim to understand. And since you and I are just getting to know each other, let's not argue about these things, about the nature of God. Let's study the things that we're likely to see more eye to eye on. But what I'm doing, so he's coming at me saying, let's fight, and you're saying, let's be friends. And I think if you take that approach, instead of trying to show your proof text, that you can get through the book of Daniel, and that will really undermine the philosophy that's eating him up. And if you can degrade it that way, then maybe he'll be ready to see that Jesus accepted worship, something that no one besides God should do. Is there another question here before? I like that question, by the way. Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm sure in the Hadith somewhere that Muhammad said it, and it's not in the Quran. And Islam has very many things that are done without any rational basis. For example, when you're breaking your fast in the evening time, hundreds of millions of Muslims will eat 3 dates. That's because there's a hadith that that's the way Muhammad broke his fast. He had 3 dates, and therefore, since that time, hundreds of millions of Muslims are going to break their fast with 3 dates. As a Christian, you would want to ask, why 3 dates? And was that descriptive or prescriptive? Was that something we're supposed to copy or just something that happened to happen? Was it because he happened to have 3 dates with him? Maybe there weren't 4 dates in his hand? You know, like we would ask a lot of questions like that, but no one's asking those questions in that context. They're just trying to copy. Any other question here? Yeah, we'll take that last and I'll close. So Nick is asking about the status of Mary in Islam. There is an entire chapter in the Quran named Mary about this topic. And what that chapter says are some things that I don't want people to be reading. Like it says that when Mary gave birth to Jesus, she was in a lot of pain and was holding on to a tree. And that when Jesus came out, he came out speaking in full sentences. If Jesus came to be like me in every way, then he didn't come out speaking full sentences. You understand? But yes, because of that chapter and some things that are written elsewhere, they do regard Mary in a very high regard. In fact, Mary is a fairly common Islamic name. I've met several Miriam, or there's various versions of it. But Islam and Catholicism are so similar in their iterations, even though they differ so much in their foundation. It's because at their foundation there is this idea that good works overcome bad works, that good works cancel bad works. The Quran says that. Good deeds cancel bad deeds. That's like almost a direct quote of the Quran. And that idea leads to a lot of ritualistic doing. So I remember when I was in Senegal some time ago, on the beach, I saw people on the beach with prayer beads. And I thought, oh, these are Catholics. They weren't Catholics. They were Muslims, just doing the very same thing Catholics do. just the same thing. Instead of Hail Marys, it was reciting surahs from the Quran, but it's the same business. Yeah, so there's a lot of similarities there. In fact, I find it helpful, not the first day, but maybe 2 months into a study or a month, to say that there's really only 2 religions in the world. That's what I tell them. There's a religion of commandment keepers who are receiving God's grace and atonement, and those who are earning their own way to heaven and depending on mankind for guidance. These are the only 2 religions, and I say that second religion has so many iterations, which just means so many varieties of how it works. Okay, well, now I've gone over time. That makes me feel like I used up my whole hour. Let's pray, and we'll be done. Our Father in heaven, I'm asking that you would find a way to help us reach some people in Australia, some people elsewhere in the world. Would you please guide us to someone that matches our weaknesses and ignorances so that we can have the joy of leading them to you? Fill us with your Spirit, we ask in the name of Jesus.